It was the vote more than a century in the making. After 120 years of being blocked, the House passed a bill this week making lynching a federal crime. The legislation is named after Emmett Till, the 14-year-old who was kidnapped and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of flirting with a white woman. The brutality of his murder and the acquittal of his white assailants helped to fuel the civil rights movement. The Senate passed a version of the bill last year. After both chambers formally reconcile the differences, it will be sent to the White House, where President Trump is expected to sign it into law. Members of Congress discuss the significance of its passage.
Make no mistake, lynching is terrorism. It is terrorism directed at African Americans. And lynching really, although it was started in a different form by the Ku Klux Klan, as our chairman described, for the 256 years of enslavement, lynching was used to terrorize the enslaved from rebelling. And frankly, even today, periodically you hear news stories of nooses being left on college campuses, worker locker rooms to threaten and terrorize African Americans. A vicious reminder that the past is never that far away. And in fact, the last known victim of lynching was just 25 years ago. And for the first time in history, the perpetrator was convicted and executed.
USA Today's Washington correspondent Deborah Barry joins us now with more. Deborah, why did this bill take so long to pass?
Well, the House has passed it several times. There have been efforts maybe 200 times to pass some measure or some version of the bill. But according to this expert I talked to, is mostly where it got held up is in the Senate. There were a lot of concerns by some senators, particularly Southern senators, about federalizing this law, making it a federalized law. And there was concern about the language. Lynching was a very powerful and divisive word, to say the least.
But tell us a little bit more. Help us to understand what some of those concerns might be by these senators, because I think for most people hearing this, the idea that lynchings would not already, why this legislation hasn't already passed, why lynching wouldn't be a federal crime, and the fact that, as we just heard, the last lynching took place in this country 25 years ago.
Right.
I think all of this is stunning to people.
Yeah, but then there's, as you well know, a lot of senators, a lot of lawmakers in particular, have concerns about states' rights and whether it should be a federal law or whether it should be a state law. And so there are a lot of concerns about who should have control over that particular issue. So there aren't that many laws that are federalized. This one was one that became an issue in that way. So that was one of the biggest fights about it. And even now, with the 4 who just voted against it, some of them raised some of those same concerns even today.
And you spoke to one of the sponsors of this bill, Illinois Representative Bobby Rush,
Right.
and he explained why this was especially significant to him. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, Emmett Till, his family actually comes from Bobby Rush's district. So what he remembers in particular, what struck him, he said, and still brings out emotions, is that he remembers when he was 7 or 8 years old, and his mother sat the family down to show them the cover of Jet. And on that cover was an open coffin of Emmett Till. His mother made sure that she wanted the world to see what happened to her son. So he remembers that. He said it struck him and it changed his life. And so when it came up, when Jesse Jackson called him last year to talk about, whether you should push to make sure that this is a law, he said that he had to do it. And so he's been pushing for it ever since.
And walk us through what this law would do, Deborah.
It would, I know some people have reported that it would be a hate crime, but what it does is it adds to the section of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. There are several acts already under that subsection, but it would add lynching there too, so it would make it a federal law. And some of the penalties are up to 10 years. Now there are some concerns about that. Some of the people who opposed it argued that that's not tough enough. Some of the supporters would argue that it's not tough enough. But they also argue that as part of a compromise to get a measure or some kind of measure passed, they had to do this. And this meant it was not as tough as they would like it to be.
Deborah, while we have you here, I want to ask about your new article out today looking at how people are working to ensure an accurate count of people of color in the 2020 census. What can you tell us?
There's a big push, as you well know, to count everybody, and that's what the census is supposed to be about. But there's an even bigger push, particularly among some grassroots groups, civil rights groups, voting rights groups, to make sure that people who are considered, quote, hard to count are included. They argue that for years, for the last few decades in particular, a lot of them have not been counted correctly or accurately. And with that comes the cost of not getting a fair share, quote, of federal funds. So there's a big push between the census and all these community partners across the country to target these groups. And that would be everything from making sure that the material is in language, particularly Asian languages, to make sure that they go knocking on doors in communities. Particularly, I went out with a group from CASA. They went knocking on doors in the Latino community. There's efforts by the National Urban League and the Black Women's Roundtable, all these groups to make sure they go to these communities. They go knocking on the doors. They go to the churches, the barbershops, and all those places to make sure folks know, number one, that it's coming, and two, that you should be counted and why it's important to your community.
Right, we've heard a lot of misinformation, particularly in communities of color, about what people are trying, in the government are trying to do, and some fear from the Trump administration.
Right.
You know, there was a number in your article that really stood out to us. I want to put that back on the screen. According to Jeannie Abrams McLean, the vice president of the group Fair Count and also the sister of Stacey Abrams, she told you that 3.7 million African Americans were missed in just the last census. How does that happen, and what's really the significance, if you could explain that for our viewers?
Sure. Well, there's different arguments about how it could happen, but some communities, some people may not know that the census is coming, may not respond to the census, may not be prepared for it, may not know that you count everybody in your household that day, especially the children. In fact, the children are the most undercounted group of all. With that, of course, the big consequence, which is what all these groups are pressing hard to let folks know, is that if they don't count the 5 people in your house or the 10,000 in your community, you might not get the federal funding you need for the streets or the school lunches or whatever else is important in your community. So that's why there's a big effort to make sure that all these groups are counted. And it's not just African Americans, which is what Fair Count in particular or Ms. Abrams were talking about. You got people on reservations, you have Latinos, you have immigrant groups and communities who now, in some ways, many of them are afraid to even respond because the citizenship question was hanging out there. So you have a lot of groups that either don't know enough about it, are afraid of it because it's coming from a government agency, and are hesitant to fill out any papers that they think might put their business out there, their private information. So sometimes it's a hard sell, and that's why these groups are working really hard to make sure it happens, including the census. The census has put millions of dollars into programs and ads, as you probably see all over the place now, to make sure that these groups know that they should be counted and why it's important.
And as you say, so important for the federal funds and for representation, especially in communities of color. Deborah Barry, thank you so much.
Sure, thank you for having me.